Today's guest is Stephen Jarvis. Stephen Jarvis is an independent researcher and founder of Xemdir, Theoretic Energy and Propulsion Systems. Stephen has written 60 papers on his concept of the zero-dimensional time and space theory, and he seeks to unify the discrepancies between general relativity and quantum field theory, not by throwing away physics, but instead by using his number theory to explain why the inconsistencies occur between these two theories and how they actually must exist, and then ultimately shows various other mathematical and physics-based paradoxes and problems that can be addressed using this same theory. His theory aims not to approach the idea of a moment in time and a point in space, and instead it presents a mathematical framework which describes these aspects of space and time directly. And he's also seeking to present an explanation for the phenomenal experience of consciousness, as well as present theories for what could be beyond the solar system. His work also seeks to present explanations for both the micro or quantum, and as well as the macro, everything from the level of the neutrino and below to the level of galaxies and what extends beyond what we can conceive of before the Big Bang. Now, before we can get started, it must be noted that in no way am I an expert in physics or any of these topics. I'm just somebody who's curious and is trying to share that curiosity with other people. And so what I've done is just my very best to go through his papers and present my questions as well as I can. But at the end of the day, I'm learning this along with you. My education formally is in business finance and real estate, not anything technical. That said, I've managed to teach myself programming and currently work in that field. So I know that it's possible to teach yourself a lot, especially with motivation. And my goal is to bring those who are interested along for that journey with me. And because of that, what I've done is I've also gone through and taken out their various sections of Stephen's paper and actually overlaid them into the video, along with various different citations for where in the paper that you can actually find that information. So my hope is that if you're curious about this further, you'll pause the video, dig into those various different images, and then ultimately maybe even go to the websites that I've linked in the description and start learning this in more detail for yourself. These are dense topics, and I know for me it's going to take at least a couple run-throughs to really grasp everything that we covered. So I thank you for checking this out, and without further ado, we will get into it with Stephen. Our guest today is Stephen Jarvis. Stephen is an independent researcher, and he's also the founder of Xemdir. Xemdir is Theoretic Energy Propulsion Systems. And I want to just start off this discussion by giving Stephen the opportunity to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his background and how he got interested in this journey, which is, I understand, been well over 20 years now.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, James, for inviting me here. It's very, very difficult to explain and introduce something that is entirely new, that hasn't been brought through the normal birthing procedures of theories and discoveries and so on and so forth. So to really give a general overview initially of where all this is coming from, where this work is coming from, my entry into this arena was not through formal physics education. It really encompassed a multidisciplinary approach to trying to formulate what physical phenomena is by using as many different other scientific facets as possible. And so my angle from that was from my study in medicine and surgery, where I, back in the late 80s, early 90s, was interested in putting a number theory to how we perceive time. In doing that, to try to replace our basic five senses, because when I was studying medicine, it became apparent that there was so much infrastructure of sentience in the brain that we were still all learning at the time, but it didn't seem to just assume that mass is how we should reference ourselves in trying to formulate a theory in physics. So I basically thought, based on my background in getting into med school, which was primarily mathematics and physics anyway, when going in with those eyes into medicine, I was always thinking about everything I was learning in neuroscience, in anatomy, biology, biochemistry, physiology, the whole thing with a mathematical and physics approach in mind. And it's it sort of dawned on me that it would be so much easier for someone who was studying physics to find out if there was a type of number theory to how we are sentient, to how we are aware. And it it was at that point I realized, well, okay, who teaches this? Where do I go? Or do I have to do all this as a personal study myself? So at the end of the day, it was a personal study. And I ended up leaving medicine in my fifth year of study, just 1 year before graduating. And then knocking on physicists' doors and asking, who do I go to for this? Where do I get taught this sort of approach to physics? And they would all just cross their heads and say, no, it's all mass based. So I was really staring down the barrel thinking, well, I've just ended a perfect career in medicine and now I have to do this all alone. So it was quite daunting at the time. But that's one of the secret sources of really getting something done. You are staring down the barrel and you have to get it done. And that's what I was facing for the last probably nearly 30 years now. It was it feels that long in terms of how long it's taken to deliver. I think it was around 1994 when I realized that this was something that is far more important than just sort of clinically diagnosing someone and giving them a few pills. This is really big. If I can make this work, and so that was the angle I came from and why I ended up in doing this private research endeavor into temporal mathematical perception. And it eventually came to the point where I think it was in early 1999 that dawned on me that the whole anchor of that perception code for time and space has to describe the idea that we live in time's moment. We don't live in the future, we don't live in the past. We always live in one moment to the next. And that's one thing that physics hasn't really executed as a description of why we exist in the moment. Physics even takes the idea that it's possible to travel back in time or into the future. But I took the approach, the scientific approach, probably because of the medical background I had in having to be completely realistic about what was being proposed, that I had to somehow form a theory that was central to time's moment. So I spent all of the 2000 to 2010 working out how to combine time's moment with space and those different dynamics of before and after, how they can all come together. And I wasn't having much luck with that until I decided to focus more peripherally on some of the things that are apparent in nature, such as the golden ratio, um, as patterns in time that form. If you notice that whenever you go to a site on the web and you look at how people promote the idea that the golden ratio exists in nature and how these patterns form, whether they're in shells or flowers or whatnot, they're all growth patterns in time. So when I looked at those growth patterns in time as those spirals formed in time, it became apparent that the golden ratio had to be part of that time equation, central to time now. So I thought, well, how am I going to do that? And it sort of came to me after doing quite a lot of reading for about 6 years in private research to just grab the bull by the horns and find out how a quadratic solution could form from two aspects of a time equation. And that's when I reached the paper one level of the time equation, releasing the two solutions of the golden ratio. And the interesting thing about that was I had to define time now, not as zero. So I didn't define the moment in time as zero, but it was the value of one if it exists
Right.
everywhere universally. But I did define a spatial point as zero. The problem with defining a spatial point as zero is that it could be any size. It could be from zero to infinity, and you don't know how many other spatial points are around you. You don't have any reference to know how one spatial point relates with another. So to uncover that golden ratio code using time before, time now, and time after, I made the decision to make time before as a known entity because that's what our consciousness is used to as a memory. Time now as the moment that we live in is one, but time after as an unknown, as we understandably cannot see the future, but we do have a memory of the past. So all these facets cleaved perfectly with um, a medical understanding of how we are sentient. And interestingly, putting all that together where time after defaulted to time before squared, still as an unknown, whether it can be one value of the golden ratio or another, resulted in the golden ratio equation. And so that was just the first few pages of the first paper of the 60 papers. So my next question was, how do I apply this to physics theory? Instead of just building it from scratch, how do I first see if this can actually fit into basic EM and gravity equations? And so the idea was to interrupt the idea of distance and put the idea of time in the classical equations of gravity and electromagnetism. And that seemed to work fine. So the next step after that was to then see what the first step in physics was and in modern physics. And the first step in modern physics was care of Niels Bohr and Einstein in formulating the electron and the electron shell and the whole idea of the atom. And so my idea was to therefore underscore that, to try and derive the electron shell, and then therefore say that if I can derive that electron shell code using the golden ratio, therefore this can underscore modern physics. And then I should pursue it. And that's what happened in the first paper. I was able to underscore the electron shell structure using that golden ratio code. And then following that, each paper step just dived a little deeper into known ideas of physics until paper 15, I think, where it was necessary to define the value of pi using all that structuration, and then also introduce the idea of Euler's number. And that was achieved in papers 15 and 16. And from there, everything just, went out. It just fanned out like it was doing its own thing and just saying, what else can we do? What else can we do? Right down to the level of the neutrino. And all of that is summarized in the most recent paper in paper 60. It goes through all those different layers and levels. And the interesting thing about in paper 60, because the whole idea of using the golden ratio as the time equation and Euler's identity as the space equation, there's a discontinuity there between the time equation and the space equation. So what happened there was it became, in deriving the value of pi, there was another process involved in how the time equation represented the quantum wave function and all those different features of the quantum wave function. And the only way that the time equation could represent a quantum wave function would be to use a slightly abnormal value for pi, which constantly had to correct itself. which then describes how time as a quantum wave function relates with space. And
And
none
that
of
would be the
this,
pi error.
that's the pi error in paper 60, yeah, which then had to be proven to be correct by deriving the correct value for the speed of light and the correct value for the fine structure constant, which it did. It derived both of those, which it's like you have a fundamental basis for a number theory that then conjectures how that time equation as a quantum wave function relates with space around it as Euler's identity, then doing all those number theories and going through all the Clay Mathematics Institute questions and seeing if you can solve all of those. And once you do that, then ask, okay, well, if there's a temporospatial sentience code that you can use with a zero-dimensional number theory, and you just use one scale that can be applied to that whole spectrum of things, and that was the Bohr radius. Just applying that one scale, then derive the speed of light and the value for alpha. So that is no fluke. That sort of speaks in volumes in terms of what this can achieve. Without trying to do it deliberately. It even described why the speed of light is a constant for any relative frame of motion. Um, it described that it built it. It was the only way that the speed of light could be built. And no other theory has been able to do that. I've seen theories that say, oh, yeah, this is the speed of light. You just use these numbers, blah, blah, blah. But that's not how you calculate the speed of light. You have to calculate every single feature about the speed of light. And that was reached probably September last year, and I didn't really know how to execute that. And my idea was to repair one of the previous papers, and that was paper 57, because paper 57 did something really important in identifying how modern physics has evolved into two different types of number theories, like flat space-time and curved space-time, quantum field theory and general relativity, respectively. So for the theory, the zero-dimensional number theory, to derive why that happened in time, that was also a landmark piece. But in deriving the speed of light, it became apparent that embedded in the code of deriving the speed of light is the Royal qubit value, which I did not expect to just sort of show itself. And then going back into paper 57 that described the infinitesimal process of calculating numbers way back to ancient Greece, I thought, well, was it the case that in ancient Egypt that everything seemed to gel together with what they were doing? They believed in a type of superior being, a number of superior beings as their subjective reference, and they use the Royal qubit as their number theory to then understand the movement of the stars and the planets. So they had those three things in play. They had the social code of the gods, they had the formal code as the Royal qubit and Pythagorean logic and triangles and whatnot, and then they had the natural science code of trying to measure the stars and trying to predict the stars. So in paper 60, as an upgraded paper 57, all that has been brought into effect, has been described to highlight that this zero-dimensional number theory is actually something that we've been doing without knowing since our own sciences began, quite literally since that time. And in doing that, a whole new spectrum of ideas becomes apparent when you look at the different features of the time equation. For instance, if the time equation says time future is unknowable, then that itself creates the idea of how does that relate to physical phenomena? Is there certain things in our physical reality that prevent us as a phenomena from seeing into that future? And that will probably become apparent the more you read, have a look at the results of paper 60. And that's just an
Yeah, and the
introduction of,
implication.
yeah, yeah.
The implication on free will, even potentially, if we go down the philosophy route a little bit, that's something that's interesting as well. I think so. Just to kind of summarize what I understood from what you were saying is that you were working in the medical field where you were experiencing things in your conscious that didn't seem like they aligned with the reality of the situation, for lack of a better word. And that kind of led you to this concept of perhaps trying to form a number theory that underlies the way that we approach mathematics. And so through doing that, you ultimately discovered that there were things that we already have in physics, GR, QFT, that don't necessarily align. We have various paradoxes in physics. We have certain constants that we take as constant, and we don't necessarily know where they come from. But ultimately, almost in a serendipitous way, what you've discovered is that this theory is actually able to apply and potentially even solve a lot of those questions, lending a lot of credence, I would think, to the time you spent working on this, right? That is beyond physically developing a machine to test this. I think that is the best thing that you can possibly have. I would like to understand, just so we can get a better idea of how this formed. You mentioned Niels Bohr. You also mentioned, the philosophy of the ancient Egyptians. Are there other individuals that have inspired this for you? You mentioned, 5, 6 years of just reading, trying to get a grasp on all of this. What people have kind of formed your perspective on this?
I think there were two key events in the 1980s that really captivated my interest in this. The first was the introduction of fractal topology in the early 80s. I don't know why at the age of 15 I'd be so fascinated with it. It just sort of captivated me. And the second thing that captivated me was string theory. Um, in the Once again in the mid to late 80s, they were all just new things coming out. And at the time, I was deeply interested in a study of mathematics and physics. Why I went into medicine, it was just really due to the fact that my dad, he was a doctor then, he was a really smart guy, and he was so inspirational. And I just thought there has to be something in medicine that has made me like I am and made him like who he is. But he was always a hands-on type of guy. He was thinking about different ways of doing surgical procedures and whatnot. So that's what my interest was. I was thinking, well, okay, I'll do medicine, but at the same time, I still can't let go these fascinating concepts in fractal topology and string theory. And so that really drove me in medicine to 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 achieve what I did. I mean, ultimately, when I was in med school, I was sort of reading medical textbooks, trying to learn something, blah blah blah. Had to recite it again in the examination, and to do that over and over again. And at the end of medicine, you basically forge a type of niche that you're interested in, and then you form a relationship with your patients and your duty for care and so on and so forth. But my pursuit was to really try to find what type of fundamental ingredient exists to make sentience what it is. And that sort of led me to think, well, you just have to dive in the deep end and put a number theory to how we are sentient anyway. Like, sure, we live in time's moment, so just make that one. We do have a memory of the past, so that is a time domain that we have to use. And there is also a future, so that has to be used as well. So you put all those three together, and then you let that forge into a zero-dimensional number theory, and then test that with known concepts in physics. So it wasn't as though that I knew exactly what to do. It was like an evolving process. It was one step to the next, and it's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger with all the new advancements that it's made. It was never intended to be what it was. I mean, this, this time last year, I had no idea that I was going to be writing papers 57, 58, 59, or 60, they were not on the cards. It just happens that you spend time thinking about it, and voila, it happens. When you review your own work and try to link all that together, it happens.
Right. So I think that's a good time. Could you kind of tell us more about Xemdir, the company that you formed, and how that plays into these papers and this philosophy?
Yep. The Xemdir is the fundamental idea of what the time equation itself proposed as how mass particles um, come into existence from a certain resonance of a quantum wave function, and how also on the other end of the scale, how space itself can be enhanced with a certain resonance of a quantum wave function. So Xemdir basically is X with EMDIR, and EM is electromagnetism, and DIR is destructive interference resonance of an EM wave function. And the X stand is meant to symbolize an absolute destructive interference resonance of quantum wave function. And that is the essence that the theory has found for gravity, for 0 point gravity, which also has a negative energy character. So the company was made just to coin the term to make it very clear, um, like saying this company sells food and it's called food. This is empty because this is what this company does. It does this field. So it was just there to do, and that company name was coined, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Before that, it was gravimetric. The whole idea was to find out back then how to form a a nexus between gravity and electromagnetism. So it wasn't gravitoelectrics, it was gravimetric. Um, and that name was just enhanced. And the company was formed primarily as a publishing company to publish the papers and to have the rights, but also as a way to purchase research equipment, to put purchase orders in, and so on and so forth, to keep the whole papers real. And so I
Right.
think it's to the research is up to the experiment series 7, or sorry, it's up to series 8 now. And so that requires having a company to make these purchases. And most of this equipment comes from overseas, like the microwave generator or the resonance chambers and whatnot. Um, but I'll get to that later. When yeah, when you'd like to
Yeah, I
talk
definitely want
about
to dig into those
it.
experiments. I
Yep,
would maybe we're jumping the gun a little bit here, but I have a note. So paper 57 talks about the 0 point gravitational field effect that can be measured experimentally. Is that kind of what you're alluding to?
exactly. Yep, totally. Um, the issue with paper 57 is that, and I shouldn't really be giving away too many spoilers, but it does need amending. The work there does need amending, and that was another reason why I've decided to do paper 60 as a review of paper 57. And you'll see in paper 60 that chapters 18 to 21 have been left blank because that's where the new project will be uploaded. Perhaps in a few months when it's all ready. I'm just still waiting for certain things to come together from overseas. Um, it's a timely process. It's very particular. It's very specific. But the whole idea is to create an EM resonance. And a lot of people who do their research into electrogravitics, um, some of the ideas in skunkworks, they use EM fields, they use microwave fields, but they never actually do it in a refined and precise way to create a certain resonance of those EM fields destructively interfering with each other. And that's the whole essence of what the theory has found with the quantum wave function. It hasn't proven this yet, but everything that has proposed has derived data that we already know is true. So if this proposal is able to, in its construction, derive all that data that we already know is true, that we've already experimented with, then why not do this next step? And that's what paper 57 and paper 53. It was paper 52 that actually described the mechanics of the quantum wave function and how it can both produce mass and the idea of 0 point space. And then paper 57 went to the next level of saying, this is how it can be done this way, using this chamber, using these cables, blah, blah, blah. The biggest problem with the experiments so far have been getting a perfect EM field to resonate against itself. To do that, you have to get absolute consistency between two EM fields that destructively interfere with each other. And then you have to deal with the adverse side effects of what happens when those EM fields destructively interfere with one another. And that's where the theory finds that you get all sorts of chaotic effects coming into play. And not only that, you also get radioactive effects, because essentially you're destroying matter and you're destroying light. So when you do that, you create this effect that is basically what radioactive decay is. It's a destruction process. So it's dangerous. It's not something I want to go into very quickly, but that's why I've decided to do a review of paper 53 and 57 to highlight all these dangers for anyone who wants to go into this sort of stuff, because it's very dangerous. And another one of there are some peculiar results that are proposed to occur, because when you use this EM field that destructively interferes with itself, because the theory proposes in an X formation of that destructive interference, and which was alluded in at the end of paper 60 with the ellipsoid proposal for the configuration of space. In that regard, you get the propelling away, because you're destructively interfering light, and then you're also destroying mass. You're essentially pushing it away. You're telling it to go away. And so when you think of all the mass objects in space, and you think of all of space itself, you can look at how objects attract to one another on their own, or you can see how space is pushing them together.
Right.
In general, you see it's the same thing. There's no difference there. So you have more space out there pushing basically on these
Right.
objects that are attracting one another. And that was then reconfirmed by using the Collatz conjecture in paper 60 to solve the three-body problem, which was a classical Newtonian problem. But it was, if you're going to solve the problem in terms of mass, you have to go down to the neutrino, because that's the lightest mass of all. And to do that, you have to work out what types of neutrinos are there, and why three types of neutrinos represent the one concept. And so, like, just realizing that, it sort of becomes apparent when you combine that with the time equation. You've got something like 3m plus 1, and then with the two processes of the ellipsoid nature of space, that continually divides until you have that whole number, which reduces itself to the requirement that reality must exist in time now, which equals 1. And that's what the Collatz conjecture is. But the thing about this propulsion system, when you use that EM destructive interference resonance to create that spatial effect, you're propelling things away from that space. So you're creating a non-inertial, because there's nothing that thing that you're pushing away can push back against. So you're creating a non-inertial basis for gravity. And that's the key to how non-inertial propulsion systems would work. But there's two other interesting features to that. The first one I suggested was radioactivity. So you would have a radioactive process. The second is how you would, in pushing light away, if you were to use this with a craft, you'd make that craft push light away or curve around it. So these craft would be translucent. You would not be able to see them unless they turned that field off. And the third thing is you would not be if you expose yourself to that craft, you'd be in a lot of trouble because it's radioactive, it warps space time, and it will just compress you into whatever. So it's everything seems to be against it, which is why it has to be described properly and carefully and given all due caution and warnings to those who want to dive into it. I know that in my lifetime, I would not want to be inside a craft using this type of energy field. I would have it as a jet engine. It's like putting your head in a jet engine. I would not want to do that. So, how certain people, sorry, how this idea can be considered as a natural phenomena and where is the evidence for that? I would think the things or whatever they use this type of gravity field have adapted to it over a very, very long time. And it's not something we should dive into very quickly at all. It should be treated very, very carefully. Yeah.
Right. It is interesting that you say that though, because those are all of the hallmarks of UAP, UFO phenomenon is cloaking, manipulation, even potentially of time, things of that nature, these
Well,
radiation or
it's
radioactive effects.
the interesting thing with time is because of the time equation says the time future is unknown, and the gravity equation, e to the I pi plus one equals zero, it says that you're going to get temporal anomalies. You'll have missing time with this
Right.
gravitational effect. You'll have also not just missing time, but you'll have compressed time. So that would be another phenomenon. So you're ticking all these boxes of what this so-called natural phenomena might be. And I use that term natural phenomena in that if this is a true theory for gravity, then those who see this phenomena would understand that this is a type of natural phenomena, like watching, industrialized insects zapping around the place, going in and out of the dimensions with temporal anomalies, leaving behind radioactivity and being completely non-inertial. But the real concern there is that, that is not something that we can say is ours because the theory says that all that will just destroy our biological matrix. It's completely toxic. Um, and those who are there have they would have had to have evolved into that over tens of thousands of years. It's just incredible how long that would take, or perhaps manufactured. I don't know. But I can understand that phenomena is out there and you see it on the news all the time. You see it on TV shows, you see it on all sorts of things. But when I went into this theory, that was not my quest. My quest was not to try to explain what these people are saying and what they say they've seen. My quest was to find a more fundamental link between quantum field theory and general relativity by taking a fractal approach to what I thought back then was string theory, which was superseded by the quantum wave function as the string itself, and then applying that to Euler's identity as the space equation. But it's just fascinating how it then delivers a description for all this unknown phenomena that we can't explain. Yeah, I don't know how to
So
quantify it.
I'm just curious, do you think that it sounds like what you're saying is that this is the implications of this are so large that it's unlikely that human beings have been able to engineer something that actually physically works using these principles?
Yeah,
Or is that not what you're
I would
saying?
I would say that. I would say anything. I would say that we if they did, well, see, I don't know. It's all folklore. But let's say that there's a craft out there, and I saw one in a few days' time for the first time or something like that. And I asked myself, is there a human in there? I would say either they've got some type of, super advanced suit that immunes them from this field, which is hard to believe because this field is spatial. This will just permeate everything. Um, or it's not ours. It's not us. I would be more likely after understanding this theory to say it's not us. but at the same time, it's natural because it's using the right theory of gravity. But in saying
Right.
that, this is the paradox. The theory proposes, after building the structure, the overall structure of the solar system, from the Oort cloud to the hydrogen wall, and even getting all the apparent dimension, the time lines right for the various objects in the night sky, um, and the age of the universe, the CMBR value, all of that, getting all that right, getting the values of the sun right through this derivation, it then proposes that in having derived the precession of Mercury, that Earth would have its own precession as well, and that would be around 26,000 years. And this would happen basically, there would be a complete Earth cycle would be 26,000 years, and this would have been going on for eternity. That's the thing. So if we're deriving this for the first time, and this is why I don't like back engineering anything, because it just defeats the whole purpose. I mean, we're humans, we should work this out on our own, and that's what this theory is all about, working it out on our own. So if we do it the right way and not try and back engineer, we get to the point of realizing, is that going to be us in 26,000 years? And if that is us in 26,000 years, we are looking at the future that we should not be talking about, but we should not be trying to back engineer at all, because we have to do this on our own. So that's the
Right.
thing. That's sort of that. If I would not want to go into the whole process of trying to look at something that I didn't understand and then trying, to put square pegs in round holes. That's, yeah, I'd rather learn how to do it from the basics. And yeah, that's what my hope is, that that's how this will work out. That, we understand that anything that might seem strange or unusual out there, that's still natural. That's still part of, whatever cycle that's a part of. But at the same time, we have to observe all the necessary portions and issues that are associated to a new science and a new technology. And we should measure our achievement there based on our own merits and not on us trying to compete with that other natural phenomena that's out there.
Right. Yeah, we don't need to steal the teacher's answer sheet. We can figure this out
Oh,
ourselves.
that's it.
So I wanted to spend a little bit more time. You were talking about aspects of the solar system or aspects of the universe beyond our solar system.
Yeah.
And you go into this concept of electron degeneracy and how that relates to our experience of seeing the sky at night, for example. I was hoping you could go more into detail on that.
Yep. The whole idea of the electron degeneracy process was how it was possible to derive the mass of the neutrino. And the only way that the mass of the neutrino could have been derived was if the electron became degenerate to get down to that level of the neutrino, to split up and to give it that process to make that happen. So the electron degeneracy process was proposed to happen, according to the use of using the speed of light as a spatial scaling and surveying key, which was described in paper 60. But back then it was just a conjecture. Back in papers 31 to 35, where the electron degeneracy process was proposed, the idea of using C as a scaling mechanism to measure a proposed theoretical solar system was how to say, okay, let's use the speed of light as a certain yardstick, and then use other derived numbers with that to then ask what is the maximum distance from the sun, the theoretical distance in a theoretical universe, a theoretical solar system, from the sun to the Oort cloud and then back to the hydrogen wall. And taking it back to the hydrogen wall was basically the solution to how an electron becomes degenerate. So then it was proposed, it was a deduction that this is what would happen in the hydrogen wall. And so in doing that, references were made to the Voyager spacecraft because that's basically about where they are at the moment. And the proposal in the papers were that they're not going to be working for much longer. And lo and behold, they become degenerate themselves because they're going through this field effect. They're losing their transmission integrity. And no one predicted that, but this theory did. This theory predicted what is most likely going to happen to the Voyager spacecraft, which is interesting, but the more difficult derivation from what happens in the hydrogen wall is that you get down to that pure spatial level that represents basically, for want of a better term, dimensional wormholes from where that happens to elsewhere, because technically, if space is both zero and infinity is one, it can be anywhere and everywhere. So it represents a certain immediate type of process of being anywhere and everywhere. So when you have that effect in the hydrogen wall, you then create the idea of what happens to light when an electron becomes degenerate. So you have light associated to the electron. What happens to light when that happens? And what the theory found is that if you use the C-scaling approach, what happens to light is you get the appearance of the stars beyond the solar system. It's projected outwards in a holographic fashion on that level, on that spatial level. Although light is limited by C, with space, it's a paradox, and it happens immediately everywhere at once at the same time. But in saying that also, spatial waves themselves, because they're related to this process, they do operate on a C basis, because with gravity waves, you are using the idea of mass, which is a result of a certain resonance of light. So it thus must obey the speed of light requirement. But underneath all of that, there is a basic spatial, as the theory finds, process. And in using that process, C-scaling process, it was possible to make two conclusions. And one required using the Earth as a particular type of C-scaling reference with that projected arena of the stars. And the second approach used the idea of the sun itself and how light pings between the sun and the Earth over a whole solar cycle year, and how that is related to what we also see, because bear in mind, space is still as one in this solar system, and so it is carrying all that information beyond what is the known limit of the Oort cloud. So I put all that together, and lo and behold, it calculates what would happen with the most distant objects at 13.8 billion years. And that's from the farthest, and to the closest, it predicted, I think, the closest star to our sun. And it got those both right. And that was at paper 32 and 33. And when that happened, I thought, now I'm in trouble, because now this is just going to sound a little bit far-fetched, getting those things to happen. So then I thought, okay, instead of just sort of leaving it at that, I'm going to further investigate this whole idea of the electron degeneracy with the value of the neutrino. And certain mathematical ideas were able to be uncovered in the form of prime numbers. And that was a learning in itself on how to then apply all of these findings to the Clay Mathematics Institute Millennium Prize problems, using prime numbers and dimensions, and how flat space-time can link with curved space-time, and so on and so forth. Fermat's conjecture, the whole thing, and putting that into the same context of what this sentient time-space based number theory can do with the zero-dimensional number theory, and how that can then be scaled using the Bohr radius to then validate what we already know of physics data. So it's
Right.
huge. Um, and just on a technical point, it was through this whole process, and one standout feature, the elephant in the room here, is that I just did this all on my own. It just sort of, I had no collaboration whatsoever in doing this, but it was really the nature of the process. There was no one to actually talk to. There was no formal study that was teaching this. It was just staring into the darkness and letting the logic speak for itself. Which is why I've kept really quiet about it for about 20 or so years to let the work speak for itself. I think this is the first time I've spoken to someone who's interested in the work in this way. It simply because it my focus has been to allow it to speak for itself, to get the job done, and to not sort of try to get someone interested halfway in the process, but to give them the whole pan vision of what it can achieve, and then to be tested, be tested with question and answer, and whether or not certain strange natural phenomena can actually fit that phenomena itself. Um, and all of that phenomena, I've only just recently becoming acquainted with. I mean, if I was to be told that certain natural phenomena out there is radioactive, it uses certain microwave resonances, it is translucent to light sometimes, you get temporal anomalies, you have missing time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and these people don't look human. Well, I would think, well, that's got nothing to do with my work. I've never mentioned that at all in any of my work, and that was never the motive to describe any of that. But it just so happens that when you have a fundamental non-inertial theory for gravity, this is what happens.
Right. Yeah. When you stare into the abyss will stare back into you. And
Well said.
I
Yeah.
guess just kind of on a slightly different note, how have you managed your own sanity over this process without having people to talk to? That's partly why I started this channel, was to be able to talk to people about things that I'm interested in. So I'm just kind of on an aside, and then I think we should just take a quick break and we'll come back. But yeah, how have you held up over this process?
I think I've held up in this process by being conditioned by the actual temporospatial, for want of a better word, sentience code. I've basically structured my whole thought process in that. And because of that, I have a healthy respect for the fact that the future will always be unknown. So I don't dive in to
Mhm.
any of the off-world stuff. I don't dive into the paranormal. I don't dive into anything that has anything to do with an afterlife reality. I respect the fact that it's all unknown, and I just deal with what is, what's real, and what's in the here and now. But I do respect the fact that there is a lot of stuff out there that is in that, time after paradigm. But at the same time, I respect the fact that my work tells me that all of that must be an unknown and must be kept as an unknown. So, if the invitation's out there for me to explore that further, I probably will shy away from it because I'm just conditioned to do that. And I think that's where my sanity lies. It's so grounded in the writing. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that follows, you're preaching, you're practicing what you preach at the end of the day, right? So I think that makes complete sense. When we come back, I'd like to dig into a little bit more of how time before plus one can equal time after, or time squared can equal time after, and then dig into that. All right. So let's get back into this. We'll go ahead and jump in again. So as I alluded to before the break, the understanding of how time is sequenced. We have time now, which is what we're fundamentally experiencing at every moment, and that's represented with a one. And then we have space, which is represented with the concept of zero. And one of the equations that you have here is how time before and time now lead to time after. And something I just wanted to clarify, and I'll more than likely be putting the equations here on the screen for the video, but for right now, I'm sure you know the equation. So I just want to understand, is this essentially an equivalence where time before plus one is equal to time after? Is that equivalent to time squared, or excuse me, time before squared is equal to time after? Is there any difference in those two that's worth mentioning?
Yeah, the way I approached it in the first paper was using a type of complex number approach, and that's on pages 3 and 4 of paper one. And like the description there was quite primitive, if immature, in trying to. It was really reaching because, as I initially said, that the aim was to find the golden ratio. The issue was trying to find the right words to describe what was going on. So I knew that time after had to equal TB squared. So you have basically, um, if TA, the just going through the equations on pages 3 and 4, the the first the equation there was time after was unknown. That was to be given. I wasn't sure what time after was. And then in using figure 8 on page 4, the idea was to say that the future always represents a type of choice. And the only idea that was valid in 3 different time domains, if time now already was taken as the value of one, that only left time before. And so my only conclusion was, if there is a choice in the future between two ideas, going from before to after by and now, then you could only use TB squared in that regard.
Right.
And so, yeah, TB plus one equals TA. But I still wasn't happy with that description. It still lacked a nice mathematical tone to it. So then in paper 8, I went for the new solution process. And that's on page 3, where I introduced the idea of, if I could just say it now, if time is a singularity, we can relate time before to time after along a basic linear mathematical construct via time now. And then I say this has been the Achilles heel, it seems, of our logic of time. So let's break that down further. For instance, we know that placing time before next to time now requires a negative sign for time before, given time before is a backward negative step compared to time now. So that gave me the idea of minus time before plus one equals fundamental property A. Then there's a next fundamental property that I derived. And I said, if time is a singularity, once again, we can present the case that time now can also be per minus time before as another equation, as technically time before would already be contained within the time now context, which is a type of sentience code itself, as it would have time before would have already happened in the context of time now. So then I said 1 over minus time before, which 1 as time now, over minus time before equals fundamental property B. So then when I said, okay, these are two absolute fundamental properties, they must be equal to one another if it is on a most fundamental level. So then I said, let fundamental property A equal fundamental property B, and voila, you get TB plus one equals TB squared. So there were two ways of doing it, and both seemed to arrive at the same result. But I was
Right.
happier with the paper 8 process, because it just seemed to use both the negative sign and division as well.
I see.
So a more, yeah, a
So
more,
what you're describing right now sounds really similar to the results of the double slit experiment in a way, because we have two time before possibilities that lead to the time after, which is where does the actual wave or particle end up? So am I on the right track with that? Or
yep, that's
would
described in, yep, totally. That's
yeah.
described in paper 2. That's the uncertainty principle as well, with the temporal wave function. And it's also in paper 3 how the chaos equation is derived,
Okay.
which then leads to, yeah, by multiplying both values of the quantum wave function as theta and minus 1 over theta, the golden ratio, you get the value of minus 1. And then when you apply that to the space equation, e to the I pi equals minus 1. So that's how you have that synthesis. But the problem with the
Right.
quantum wave function is that it doesn't obey the strict definition of what pi is. And the way space-time, if you're looking for a massive philosophy in this, the way the time equation tries to accommodate for the space equation is what reality is. It's just two very fundamental ideas trying to work one another out. And the result of that is what we perceive of reality and the wheel of time itself, a 26,000 year process in that derived solar system with that derived astrophysical display. Yeah,
Right.
it's quite large.
That's fascinating. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of retrocausality. There was an experiment that kind of took the double slit experiment to another level where they had five detectors and a splitter and stuff. I'm not, have you heard of this?
No, yeah, please.
So, yes. So I think it's definitely something that's worth investigating because without kind of going down a whole rabbit hole, there's some good videos that kind of break this down and actually show the experiment in the same way that the double slit experiment is shown. But what it is an extension of the double slit experiment, where essentially instead of just having a single splitter per se, or just two slits and then a place for those particles or waves to end up, what you have is actually multiple possible places for those to end up. And what seems to sort of be a result of this experiment is that somehow the particle or the wave actually knows where it's going to end up before it does actually leave the detector or leave the emitter. And I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, but ultimately the main keyword is the concept of retrocausality, which I basically, from my understanding, is that, and this kind of contradicts in some ways the idea of time after not being knowable. And so I would love to kind of get into that more, but it almost implies that something that happens in the future can impact what happens in the time now. And
Yep.
without having a real great understanding of that, I can't go into any further detail, but I just want to maybe give you the opportunity to say whatever you want about that. And then, I think people can
That,
dig into that on their own, of course.
yeah, no, that is exactly what the time equation proposes in that grand system that I
Okay.
explained, and how space is
So time is
a
a
type.
flat circle then. Right.
Well, yeah, that's in paper 60. You've got the time
Yeah.
equation as that circle, and then you've got the spatial ellipsoid, and how they join is that immediate effect. But there's retrocausality that happens there because ultimately everything comes down to the moment. So you have the time future and you have the time past, and they have to actually meet with time now. They can only do that in a certain context. Yeah.
Okay. That brings everything together for me. Thank you. That's really helpful actually. That leads me into something that I've been kind of sitting on for a while now and just haven't quite wanted to jump into. But so we have this fundamental zero and we have this fundamental one, which ultimately leads to a binary system in a way. And I'm a big fan of the concept of information theory. So the idea that if our system is not infinite, there could potentially be a computation that could actually describe the entire universe in theory. So does what you're describing lead to, I mean, you call it a mathematical code in a way, a ones and zeros of binary. How far can that be taken? What are the implications of that?
Yep. I touched on that in paper, I think 58 and 59. I'm pretty sure it's Logic's information touchstone, and that talks about information
Right.
theory and the application of this theory to computer technology, to Boolean logic, basically. And if it's possible, um, the the problem I found with Boolean logic is that its restrictions, by its own definition, disallow a type of sentience to emerge in alliance with what would be the sentience of nature itself. So there's
Mhm.
that problem, but at the same time, because it operates by zero one in a true zero one sense, the it's such a big thing because it goes right down to the n versus np problem in the um, Millennium and Prize problems. probably one of the hardest ones to solve. You can only solve that one by solving all the other ones. And that's like, yeah, it's very difficult to compare apples with oranges here, comparing Boolean logic with the idea of using ones and zeros. Like the ones and the zeros predominantly feature in the space equation. And to then use that space equation as a code itself for digital expression of information. I honestly haven't really looked into it because once again, that's one of those unknowns for me, using that zero as the future and the one as the time now. I wouldn't be surprised if it's possible to form that link. I haven't dived into that. It's my priority is just to demonstrate this gravitational field effect, but I'm a
Right.
keen observer of all this AI that is doing the rounds in the world today and all the advances that are being made, chat GPT, the whole thing, and how um, everything is, it's basically heading that way. And one of the interesting shows that has taken my attention away from my work is Westworld. I don't know if you've seen Westworld
Yeah.
before, but
Yes.
very interesting how the first thing to do is to try to get a computer to learn the mannerisms of a person to then become a part of that theme park, and then the next step to actually record all the data of that person in a way to allow them to live forever in that digitized manner. So that's basically what Westworld is was trying to achieve, how to use a Boolean logic type construct to then go into a person's psychology and to program that computer with that psychology to then presumably have that person's psychology be captured by that digital process. Um, as I said, Boolean logic has certain restrictions, and I think Westwell dealt with that by the whole idea of the finding the center of the maze concept to find one's true fundamental psychological code that represented the type of fight flight experience of eternity with a robot with that code, and to have that imprinted there on that robot and to take the robots on that experience to then mimic sentience itself for that person to live forever. But the problem there that they found was that there was a missing link in how to keep that process rolling. In other words, the fidelity wasn't there. They were unable to keep that process rolling. And I that's although Westworld is a show, I'm sure it's been exceptionally well researched to get the script right and to make it completely believable. That's why it's such a good show. But it's yeah, it's the problem is Boolean logic and the gates, I think. But it is something I'm always going to think about every time I read about AI for sure.
Yeah, it's almost from what you're saying. My takeaway is almost that it may be possible for an AI to have quote unquote sentience or conscious, but it may be fundamentally different from the experience that we have.
Yeah,
Or
and in
is it not
saying,
possible?
well, try not to be a spoiler. I would say that what you see of those crafts that are rushing around the place in their strange way, that could be exactly what's happened in the future. What had happened, I don't know. Like, are they?
Mhm.
They might not be biological beings, but what are they? If they can do that, only computers can do that sort of thing. But
Right.
I don't know. Like, it's way too futuristic for me, and I don't look into that because you can get lost in it so deeply. And there's no way to
Yeah.
prove it unless you just make it work. But to make it work is to basically, well, how, for instance, would one make uh well, doing the Turing test, for instance, one would do something like that with the computer system, like in the movie Ex Machina. Like you sort of get to that level, but at the
Right.
same time, how is that sentient? How is that sentience itself if it's not human biology? The
Right.
way I sort of look at human sentience is that it's Um, it's human biological. Um, and I haven't even thought about whether or not the time equation with the space equation will is pure human sentience, because some people profess to actually see the future, but this theory says that it's not possible. So there's that little
Right.
issue there that I haven't looked into.
I see. No, that makes complete sense. And what I love actually, before I say that, another show that kind of tracks with these concepts is Altered Carbon, and it goes into the idea
Yes.
of humans being able to upload their themselves to a disk, right? So it's similar. What I love about the work that you've done is that I think almost accidentally just kind of draws so many parallels to ancient beliefs, teachings, mystical practices, etc. So, for example, on page 79 of your most recent paper 60, you say if temporal sentience code is used to check reality, then possibly reality uses code to check itself. And to me, that is exactly the same as the idea of the universe as we are the universe experiencing itself, which is kind of a ancient idea. And I've got a bunch of other examples of that here. And so I just wonder if you could speak to that. And, are you somebody who's spent time investigating those types of things and were kind of aware of them, or did you kind of fall into this in a similar manner that you have with a lot of the other stuff and it kind of appears in a way?
It's That's a good question. I just like anyone else who's been exposed to good TV, good movies, good science fiction. It's all there in all of that. And you sort of, when you see that and you see the story behind that, you see the scripting, the narrative, and the believability behind that, you start to question, is this can this be really true? Um, it was it's sort of it's interesting because one of my little pet projects when I was studying medicine was such a difficult thing to study. There's so many different things that happen in the human body that you have to try and nail in the exams. And I was used to just nailing mathematics and physics at school, but I just could not pack all of that medical information in my head. And I just thought, is there a human mathematical sentience code that I can use to just quickly and easily pack all this information in and store it in there, like a an internal library to keep all that information ready by coding it properly and then programming it and then teaching it how to reveal itself when I requested it. That never really happened, but what did happen, as I was saying before, is that the the theory of the temporospatial sentience code with the zero dimensional number theory, with the physical theory by applying it to the Bohr radius. That happened. When that happened, I then applied that to everything I had been exposed to, and I'm still going through that process. And one of the things that made sense to me was how the royal cubit was used, but it wasn't good enough back then in Egypt. There's no way of proving that it wasn't good enough to them, but you can look at the cause and effect of the process of what happened to ancient Egypt and how that developed into infinitesimal calculus. And how when you look at all those ancient megastructures, they started with massive, massive stones and rocks, packed together. And then the rocks just got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way to the atom. So there was this general drive of the system back then. If the system is checking itself, it was checking itself on a really, really grand scale, asking about the afterlife, all the things that the Egyptians were doing. And that's probably the cornerstone of ancient Egypt is the Book of the Dead. They were all interested in what's going to happen in the afterlife. And as I mentioned in paper 60, that's what we're doing now. We are trying to develop, well, this is what we're doing without realizing it. We are developing quantum uh, gravity technology to then develop AI. So then perhaps we build machines that we can then put ourselves into to immortalize ourselves. And that's essentially what the Egyptians were doing with the entire structure of the system that they were using then. So when you look at those two things happening at the same time, we're essentially doing the same thing. So what happened in the last 4 months? I published a paper in early December, and it was titled, I think, Quantum's Golden Ratio, Royal Qubit Scaling and Surveying Key. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, no, that's not right, because otherwise we'd go back to Egypt. We'd become the ancient, Egyptians. We'd go back to using the royal qubit. So I pulled the paper from publication and decided to use a lot of that information of that paper in the most recent paper, paper 60. And the step that I made there was to find out that the royal qubit is based on the pi anomaly. It's based on the pi error. So back then they weren't aware of the pi error. So they had to then discover how to get all the way down to the scale of the of 0 point to find out what this pi error is, to then reacquaint themselves with what the idea of gravity is. So that's how I'm reading what history is all about, really ancient history. And if, you can even look at the Mayans with the same type of lens. It's the same approach where they would worship the gods, they would think of the afterlife, they would use their metric system, and they would build temples in honor of the astrophysical sky to then become one with the sky, with the stars. It's the same thing as what we do when we want to go on Star Treks. We're doing exactly the same thing. Nothing has changed. Yeah, but the question is, why did all this happen all of a sudden, say 3.5, 4,000 BC? Why did all of this happen back then? And I'm thinking it happened because everything just gelled, and it just, the resonance was there. It was right. We were at a point where we could join our social sciences with our formal sciences, with our natural sciences, and we just brought them all together as one. And that's
Right.
how I'm reading it at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a gentleman by the name of Richard Dolan who's been investigating kind of more of the phenomenon type of things. But something that he said that I think is really relevant is that ultimately, once a society or a let's say a sentience develops language amongst itself, it's basically on a track that's inevitable to essentially reach a point like what we're seeing right now. And it's
Yeah.
potentially something that happens anywhere and everywhere, assuming that that first prerequisite is met. And I think that goes into exactly like what you're describing right here. Um, so that's just another parallel. I'm finding a lot of these, as I mentioned before we started talking, I kind of found your work through very um, unstandard means. I was just reading a book and I decided to Google some stuff on Google Scholar, and your paper was right at the top and the only relevant one to what I was looking into. And continually, as I dig into these papers, and I think from your experience as well, these things just start to pop up that align with other knowledge from even just completely other disciplines out there, which I think is really
Yeah.
fascinating. Another thing that I'm really interested in is this concept of, a fractal universe. So things that are happening on the quantum level being mirrored potentially on the macro level. So for example, you have the the layout of something like the atom, with the mass being pretty much concentrated at the center, mostly empty space, electrons orbiting it, seeming to be somewhat reminiscent of the solar system and our mass of the sun being pretty much concentrated at the center. You have things like the way that neurons in the brain form, and then you zoom way out into the cosmos, and you look at nebulas and plasmas, and they seem to form similar neural pathways and connections. There's
Yeah.
actually a book that I have been reading by Joseph P. Farrell, which goes into the concept of perhaps plasma actually being a form of essentially non-carbon based life. And I'm curious if that has any implications for what your work has done as well.
Yeah. I left a really big cliffhanger in paper 60 that I'm pretty sure no one's really seen yet. But the it sounds like you're referring to the idea of ghosts and that sort of thing, whether or not life can exist beyond physical matter. And
Right.
when
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the whole idea of the in paper 59 that proposed what sentience was, which is why I did a U-turn after that. I found it really hard to go beyond that that wall of deriving what the idea of sentience is as temporal transcendence. And temporal transcendence as sentience is basically the time after realm. So pure sentience is what the theory finds is that time after realm, which is an unknown. And this is what stopped me in paper 58. This is what I realized in paper 58 in thinking that it's not possible to have actual physical matter in the form of a computer that is built not based on a physical construct of reality itself, because it's not part of that physical reality code that harbors the idea of sentience. And the idea of sentience that was generated in paper 59 was that astrophysical holographic projection, which then links to the Earth reference, why Earth is that center of life in this solar system. It's because of that Earth speed of light scaling that was derived. Not because of it, but that's what the scaling system derived. And so it suggested that is probably why that works. That in saying that, in having that whole system of sentience, that echoes all the way back to all the ancient civilizations looking at the stars as sentient beings, as where the star people came from, as where people go in their afterlife, as like where heaven is in the stars. It's a consistent theme in history, but the strange thing about the theory is that it just derived it from a mathematical theory. It just sort of put it out there. So now to answer your question and say what happens with the afterlife, it's beyond the electron degeneracy process. So you're looking at a process where the electron becomes degenerate. And when the electron becomes degenerate, it first requires electrical energy, but at the same time, it represents a discharge of electrical energy. So it needs to discharge to become sentient in a way. The question, therefore, is, and I mentioned this in the paper itself, is that the human body or the human neuro anatomy and biochemistry and physiology, it would more likely than not represent how how that network as a virtual process that's all interlinked is able to then not capture, but access what is happening on the sub-electron level, on that neutrino level, on that really basic spatial level. It's just a conjecture of what the paper has discovered. And so going back to what you were asking before, if robot can become sentient, it would have to have a way of going beyond the electron degeneracy process. It would have to make electrons degenerate to then capture that and to then pattern that in a way to make it sentient. And the proposal is that you could probably do that in trying to explore what this electron degeneracy process is. I would think that the electron degeneracy process is just about way of destroying electrons through a certain resonance of a certain field. I haven't looked into that yet. I'm not there yet in making those conjectures, but the theory is, if I was to say where's the theory pointing, I would say it's pointing that way, that it is possible, but it's an impossibly hard thing to do, because you're just reading in the news even this week that scientists only were able to create I think it's a Dirac electron, which is basically an electron that they think operates close to the speed of light and is virtually massless, which, I can't really, the reason why they say it's massless is because it travels at the speed of light. But the theory that the zero-dimensional number theory says that the Dirac electron is the natural state of the electron in the atom, because it's always bumping around in different parts of the shell, moving close to the speed of light, appearing as though it's massless. The problem with general relativity says that if something approaches the speed of light, it
Mass
becomes
goes up
supermassive.
high. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the
Huh.
problem with general relativity. But it's always difficult to tell that or even propose that idea to physics, because it's so deeply rooted in what is being currently taught and all the dissertations people are planning and whatnot. It's impossible to want to even consider derailing any of that, because the whole idea of the work proposed is that it's an experiment. It's a conjecture, and then it asks for those conjectures to be tested, and so that it respects that process. But at the same time, it's fascinating that to propose that what could exist beyond physical matter would, and knowing that this theory has derived it as sentience, well, then the next question is, so what's a ghost? I don't know. See,
Right.
that's the unknown that I was saying before that keeps me sane. I just don't go into that because it's an unknown. But I can
Right.
understand that everyone's different, and some people do like going into that sort of thing. And the funny thing about the that phenomena that the theory proposes is that it requires an electrical discharge, that there are temporal anomalies, and that people can be stuck in time
Hmm.
on that level.
Reminiscent.
Yeah,
Yeah, reminiscent of things that I've heard at least through the grapevine. So just
yeah,
transferring a little bit back to sort of so you have this concept of, I want to make sure I get it right. The thruster, the zero quantum thruster, zero
yeah.
quantum gravity thruster, right? And so, we have these concepts like the Alcubierre warp drive and various other means of potentially propulsion and travel. And a lot of the problems with some of these ideas is that they require extremely high energy outputs or massive voltages or currents, for example. So I'm just curious, and you may not be at that part of this, this process, but if you were to speculate, if we wanted to actually achieve, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but decoherence of the electromagnetic wave to induce electron degeneracy, would that, in your just perhaps, just theory, would that require super high levels of energy, or do you think that's possible to achieve, maybe not at such high levels?
It's all about having the right time in the right place. When you're in the right time and you're in the right place, things work out for you. But if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, everything just goes awry. And no matter
Hmm.
how much effort you make, it just won't work. So what these modern systems are trying to do with this Albuquerque system and quantum drives is they're using way too much energy, number one, because they're not using the right time theory and the right space theory. If they understood how to be more precise with the way they wanted to resonate those quantum wave functions to generate the way that they should, they have to know what those specific scales are. And that's what the theory derives. It derives what those specific scales are, and they're specific. In other words, you can't just sort of like build any sort of chamber and just put any huge amount of energy in there to hope for a result. That's not going to get you results. That's not, yeah, that's beyond, that's its own thing, trying to really sort of push itself into existence by using as much force as possible. That's certainly not what the, the zero dimensional number theory is doing. Zero dimensional number theory is using a very, very precise mathematical code correct to like 7 to 9 decimal places. Yeah,
Right.
it's,
So you're using a scalpel, and potentially some of these other theories are trying to do the same thing with a hammer.
yeah,
Right.
precisely.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying there. So, if you wouldn't mind, just indulge me a little bit. So, what do you think? Let's say that we ourselves, we fly into a black hole, for example, or we fly beyond the hydrogen wall.
Yeah.
What is beyond that?
We'll just be pushed back. We won't get through it. It'll be like a Dyson sphere and we won't know how to get through it, because that's the effect of
Okay.
space. It'll just push us back. So, and this is what you see with the phenomena of comets and asteroids. They just do a big loop. They push back and they just keep coming back in cycles. That's my thinking. What would happen if we developed this technology? We were able to use this EM field propulsion system, and we tried to punch holes through it. We would just bounce back off it. We'd be prevented from getting through. We would build bigger and bigger monsters to try and get through it, and we would just be pushed back because that's just the nature of space. That's the paradox of what that space is. Um,
I see.
and yeah.
So does that
That's
mean does that kind of play into this whole kind of conundrum of dark energy and dark matter? We have these apparent expansions of mass in the universe that we can't necessarily account for. What you're describing seems like it could be relevant to that.
yes, that's the idea. Um, when I was at the stage of paper 42 and was wondering how to go beyond the small scale with the neutrino and the derivation of the Planck constant, it became apparent that I had to then go use all that work from papers 1 to 42 to then explain what the lambda CDM cosmological model is all about. Why is it there? Is it compatible with this theory? And the lambda CDM model is the cold dark energy dark matter model. That's the current cosmological model. And so in paper 43, I presented the case, excuse me, I presented the question of what existed before the Big Bang and what exists ahead of the Big Bang shock front. So to answer that question, I just used all the tools available to me with the theory and presented the case that what existed before the Big Bang was a zero-dimensional moment in time, which is time now. That's how time
Hmm.
now is defined. And what exists ahead of that Big Bang would also be time now. So you have time now before the Big Bang, you have time now ahead of that shock front, but you also have us existing in time now as we speak. We are conditioned to exist in time now. When we look at signals coming from the moon, the sun, or Mars, we have to calculate how long it's taking light to reach us because we live in time now. There's no escaping it. So I surmise that the more correct approach to talking about dark energy and dark matter is to focus on what time now is and why we exist in time now. And that was the opening door moment for the zero infinity spatial point conjecture in paper 43. The paradox of how big is a point and how many points do we have? In other words, how do you derive dimensional space in your own magical, like if you're in a moment of time, how do you derive dimensionality? How does that become evident to your awareness? The only way I could do that is to say that if I could derive time before with time after that's linked to time now as a point in space, then by proxy, you can derive the three dimensions of space. And that's what paper 43 and paper 44 did, derive those three dimensions of space with Euler's identity, which then proposed a solution to the Riemann hypothesis.
Right.
And yeah,
Okay.
that was that was considered as a more intelligent step than saying that there was a Big Bang because it could
Right.
do all those things.
Well,
Yeah.
what you're describing is sort of the idea of like omnipotence or all knowing, being able to transcend times and space. And that once again kind of echoes a lot of various different, even religious kind of teachings. There's a book called Slaughterhouse Five, which is by Kurt Vonnegut. And I think it does a really good job of sort of describing what the experience of time now, before and after the shockwave of the Big Bang. Um, if you're not aware of that book, it might be something that's worth checking out because it basically describes how a group of other beings come down to Earth and they take a human up into their ship and basically they don't experience time as time now, but they experience time as a slideshow, for example, of every T0 or T1 that's possible, and they can just kind of flip between them. And
Yeah.
that, I always am kind of trying to grasp onto something that I can visualize in my mind. And for me, that tracks right along with what you're describing.
To visualize that, that would require, instead of not just living in the moment, but to have lived through all of the whole cycle, and to have
Right.
time before correspond with time after, and to have all that.
I
And
see.
that's why we're limited as humans. But the idea of a supreme sentience isn't limited by that, because by definition that is possible in the whole context. But for us as humans, we have that certain mortality of existing in time now without the benefit of seeing the future. But the
Right.
idea of a supreme sentience would have that constant access to that complete memory, which we don't have because we're individuals. We only have certain lifespans, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, no, I think the whole idea of a supreme sentience, I um, was very nervous about talking about, but as long as I kept it mathematical and that it wasn't anything to do with the theory itself, but the fact that that sentience does exist out there, would exist out there, because the suggestion is, the derivation is, if everything else is correct, then this would be true. So yeah, I have a more than healthy respect for the idea of an ultimate sentience. One of the little slips that I put in paper 60 was that it's interesting how with the destruction of light as the Xemdir field as an EM destructive interference resonance, you get the egg of space, or
Right.
the ellipsoid of space.
Yeah.
So some religions actually consider that as a part of their teaching, but it's like that never occurred to me. I sort of read it and I thought, well, that didn't occur to me when I was writing it, but now when I stand back and read it second or third time, there's all these undertones that there is, like, through the past 6 or so thousand years of our development socially, that we've developed a way of getting closer to the idea of God by our
Right.
certain means. And some people have different ways of doing it, whether through dreaming or through waking or through prayer or meditation, various ways. But all of those ways are ultimately personal to that person from their own reference. But some people can gather together and have a shared experience. But yeah, no, this is one of the fantastic things of using that temporospatial sentience code, that it can actually underscore all of that and uphold it, and make more sense of it, or give science some credibility to that aspect of our consciousness.
Right. Yeah, the ancient symbolism I think is a little bit more potentially than just stone carvings. I've been kind of fascinated with the connection between these sort of snake-like carvings or symbols and sine and cosine waves. And I think that that has a lot of it's kind of, once again, it's this as above, so below concept or fractal nature of not just our reality now, but even time before and what ancient people were thinking, seeming to echo what we're finding now.
Yeah, yeah. There's many possibilities that could have happened back then. One, for instance, is if you stare at the sky long enough, the night sky, for instance, you start deriving information from those who came before you, and you derive all that information. And all you can do, if you don't understand the science behind it, is just draw pictures of what you see in your mind's eye.
Right.
Anything's possible. If the theory shows that there is that link between the sky and where we are as individuals, then that would be entirely possible. And that would be a fascinating way to just find solace with nature almost.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to respect your time. It's we're getting close to the end of our time together here, but I'm curious, has you mentioned this is one of the first kind of public appearances in this format that you've done, but you've obviously been involved in this for well over 2 decades now. Have you been in contact with, any private or public companies about taking these processes to the next level? Any government organizations? What are the next steps for you with this?
The next steps are already sort of planned by the fact that I've opened up 4 chapters in paper 60 where I put TBA, to be advised, of when that would be released. And each of those 4 chapters are titled on the proposed proof for proof and schematics and the way it was done, and then a discussion of that proof. Um, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that people are very sensitive to this very issue of this technology, this science, because it might seem scary, it might seem completely disruptive, which is why I've made every single effort in each of the papers to highlight that physics is not going to go away anytime soon. It's always going to stay, because all the data that we need for this theory to work is based on using a mass-based approach, which is what physics is. And the best people to understand this theory are physicists. On the transcendental side of consciousness, the best people who could understand that feature would be those who investigate that sort of thing and who do that sort of thing. But in terms of the next step with whether I've made contact with companies or government agencies, I get a lot of invitations for publishing in papers, but the problem with those invitations is that they're not suitable for a journal exposure that companies require. So I get a lot of the basic journals doing the invitations, and what companies, learning institutions, and even government agencies require is formal publication in reputable journals who can then offer a peer review process for the idea that this is worth taking a punt with, that you should take a risk with this and develop this technology because, we think that there's something in this. And the question for me over the period of time that I've been doing the writing is having 60 papers to publish each paper was just an enormous risk financially. And I didn't want to take that because I knew it was just going to be all the early papers were just sort of written, not in a half-hearted manner, but in a way that probably wasn't representative of what should have been put in a journal. But with further advancement of the theories, that they became more refined to the point where they are now. I did contact a company, a government contracted company in the US about 10, 15 years ago and asked them for what their requirements were. And their requirements were any of their new projects, they really need to be first published and have a certain type of credible aura about them. And that's understandable. So my aim has been to find that that opportunity to have this presented, but at the same time, as I said at the beginning of the interview, that this is a multidisciplinary approach to physics. This is not just physics. This is social science, this is formal science, and this is natural science as one. And at the same time, it's really a number theory. So at best, it's like a sentience-based mathematical theory. And to put that in a journal, which one do I choose? Do I choose a mathematical one? Do I choose a physics one? Do I choose a social science one? So my approach has been to, as I was saying earlier, to build the project and to then maybe see what happens after that. I haven't got any firm plan. The only plan is to make it work at the moment. First things first, to make it work, and then I'm sure that the right process to follow will be the process that everyone agrees with, so as not to scare everyone. To have that as the right process, to make it a collective decision by people who have researched this and who know all the risks of such a disruptive technology.
Right. Yeah, that's partly the goal of this channel and many others, is to try to bring these ideas to the front, to the forefold, and allow people to start thinking about them. So I'm really grateful that you've taken your time to do that with us today. And I know that other people are going to find value in this as well. Would you mind just kind of telling folks where they can find more information about you if they're interested in contacting you? If that's something that you're comfortable with, how would they go about doing that?
Yep, sure. I put up a page on not the official website, the www.xemdir.com, but on a of the technological aspect of the work. It's www.zero, the number zero, qg.tech. And there on that page, there's a description if you want to show interest in the development of the technology, how to get in contact with me, what information to provide, and so on. So that way I'm able to focus on who it actually wants to be a part of this next step as it happens. So yeah, that's all ready to go now. Um,
Great. Yeah, I just pulled that website up and I'll make sure to link that in the video description as well. So, well, this has been a really lovely opportunity to get to know you a little bit. And I'm super grateful for the opportunity to speak with you once again. Is there anything that I haven't asked you or anything that you want to make sure that we mention before we wrap this up today?
I'm just overawed by the fact that there's so many different things that you've been able to ask. That's some of the things I haven't even thought of, that I may have been in the back of my mind, but just haven't had the time to really dive into properly. So I just hope my answers have been well presented enough and informative enough to make this a something for the readers and the viewers to listeners to think about. Yeah.
I know I'm going to have to rewatch this multiple times, and there's a lot. There's a lot of good nuggets in here to glean. So it's been a real pleasure. And whenever you have some new developments or you want to come back on, you're more than welcome. Always happy to have you here. And with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you so much, Stephen. And I'll just thank you after the recording as well.